in order to situate ourselves in the story for today, we need to talk about this account and its account in relation to the other accounts. Our story for today is what most people would describe as the story of doubting Thomas. But there are multiple accounts of the story of doubting Thomas. I don't expect you to read that, by the way. I'll use it in a second for illustrative purposes. But in this account that we have, it's different from another account where Jesus actually asks for a piece of fish. That doesn't happen in this account, but there are other things that do. And what you need to know is that this account is from the book of John, whereas there are other accounts in Luke. And we also need to remember that there is a sense that resurrection has already happened. We've already had the story of Mary outside the tomb, right? It's the story where Mary goes to the tomb, she doesn't see Jesus, and then she sees a gardener, and she sees the gardener and thinks maybe he knows what has happened to the body, but the gardener turns out actually to be Jesus, and she is amazed. And then John moves to this text. These 12 verses, which I think have generated much debate and still speak to us today. If I were to ask you to recite the story of doubting Thomas, an unfortunate title that's been put on the story for us, you might tell me something like this. The disciples were locked in a room. Jesus came into the room despite the fact that the doors were locked. And after he comes into the room, he says something to them, shows them his side, and the disciples are happy. But Thomas isn't there, and they tell Thomas, and Thomas doesn't believe that this is what's actually happening, and so he waits. And then the next week they find themselves in a room, and Thomas is there this time, and Thomas sees Jesus come into the room for a second time, and he puts his fingers in his hands and his hand in his side, and there we have it, the story of doubting Thomas, as Jesus kind of half reprimands him for believing even after seeing Jesus. And that's a story that sticks with us and lives with us and works in us, but we're forgetting, at least in the Gospel of John, an important part of the story. The part here that you see grayed out is the parts that we don't retell when we retell the story. So what I want to do for the remainder of our time here is unpack this grayed out area. This area that we don't really talk about might actually be an important part of the story. So let's dive into it together. This narrative section starts, when it was evening on that day, the first day of the week, and the doors of the house where the disciples had met were locked for fear of the Jews. Now, when you read this, you should have a couple of red flags go up. First, there is the word, the first day. This is the first day of the week. This has just happened in the story. And the first day of the week would have been like our Monday, everything returning to normal, or so they thought. And the doors of the house were locked where the disciples had met. They were locked for fear of the Jews. Now, as that reads there, this is an anti-Semitic verse. And what is confusing about it is the disciples were Jewish. Are they locked in the room for the fear of themselves? Well, probably not. The disciples are probably pretty afraid, though, of the authorities of the time. They just witnessed their leader crucified at the hands of a few elite religious authorities. So it would be safe to say that they have good reason to be in the room. You think, if you were going to take out a movement, you take out the leader, and then you probably take out number 2 and 3 as well. So the fact that the disciples are locked in a room kind of makes sense, but they're not locked in there for fear of each other or the Jewish faith as a whole. They're locked in there out of a sense of fear of the authorities. So then Jesus comes into the room and he says these words to you. Peace be with you. And after he says this, he shows them his hands and his side, and the disciples rejoice when they see him. And Jesus says to them again, peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I send you. Sometimes I forget that these words, peace be with you, are deeply entrenched in the story. I think they're there for a reason. When you think about what the disciples have gone through, it can only be described as trauma. Their last glimpses of Jesus are mixed. It's said that John maybe saw Jesus on the cross. Peter, the last time he sees Jesus, is being betrayed, or he's at least at the fringes of the crowd. Judas has sold Jesus out for silver, and they have no idea what is going to happen to them now. So for Jesus to come into the room and say, peace be with you, are reassuring words, I should think. When he had said this to them, he breathed on them and said, receive the Holy Spirit. Now, I've always thought the Holy Spirit comes at Pentecost. Maybe it does. Maybe this is just a warning, but this image is beautiful. Maybe unhygienic. He breathes on them and he says, receive the Spirit. Now, when I think of the Spirit of Jesus, I think about this man who went around and saw people who were broken and hurting, and he heals them. This is the man who goes and he teaches thousands of people what the love of God is all about. He walks on water and he invites others to walk on water with him. He sits on a donkey and he conducts a political protest as they walk towards Jerusalem. He has a conversation with a woman at the well, somebody from a different tribe, a different worldview. So that same Spirit that is said to have been in Jesus, he's now inviting his disciples to take up as well. And then he says something else. He says, if you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. And if you retain the sins of any, then they are retained. We carry around with us all sorts of things that we don't want to forgive. As I was thinking about this, I often think of forgiveness in the big picture. When somebody forgives somebody else for a wrong committed, like a murder of a child. But there are things we need forgiveness for all the time. There are things in our lives that we hurt other people with all the time. If we're not careful, we can carry those things with us. And not only that, but there is the man, just betrayed, who says to his disciples, forgive each other. I'm not going to hold it against you. Don't hold this against anyone else either. Because they're sitting in a room, and I can only imagine tensions with them running high. How could they not after what they've been through? Here's where I find this story interesting. A week later, his disciples were again in the house, and Thomas was with them this time after they'd told him about everything else. And although the doors were shut, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. A full week later, they are in the same room. The doors are locked again. And Jesus has the need to say these words to them, peace be with you. I wonder if these instructions, forgive, peace be with you, receive the Spirit, I wonder if those are the building blocks, the tools that they need to get out of this room of fear. They are locked in a room out of their own making. And Jesus is saying the way out is to forgive one another, to offer peace to each other, and to receive the Spirit. But here they are, and there's a need for Jesus to come again and to say to them, peace be with you. So this question comes to mind. Do you find yourself locked in a room out of fear? I don't mean this in the literal sense. You're all sitting in pews. The doors are not locked. But there are other rooms that we find ourselves in. Maybe it's a room of a fear of failure. You want everything you do to be just right, just perfect. And so you don't do anything at all. You are locked in a room of failure, of fear of your own failure. Or maybe you've had your heart broken. And for you, the opportunity to love again is full of fear, and rightly so. But maybe you find yourself in that room anyways. We all find ourselves in these rooms, I think. And so if you do, may the peace of God be with you. May you receive the Spirit, and may you forgive one another. And in doing so, may you find your way out of that room of fear.